More than 50 years ago, American and United Nations soldiers fought a bitter and bloody war in a country most Americans had never heard of. Many weren't quite sure what we were fighting for. I'm Walter Cronkite. In just 3 years in Korea, 37,000 Americans lost their lives on the battlefield. Thousands more are still listed as missing. Korea has often been called the Forgotten War, but never by the men and women who risked their lives in battle. These are their stories.
Major funding for this program was provided by the Disabled American Veterans National Service Foundation, working to build better lives for America's disabled veterans and their families. And by Ford Motor Company, proud to salute America's Korean War veterans. Additional funding provided by Bowater Incorporated, forever grateful for our veterans. By the PNC Financial Services Group, in thanks to those who serve our country. And by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is Jimmy's Road.
They couldn't have picked a better name for the Korean War than the Forgotten War.
Where Jimmy liked to play.
We were fighting a force that was attempting to overthrow the world.
This is Jimmy's grass, where Jimmy liked to lay around.
It was a very nasty, dirty, brutal war for the brave Americans who had to fight it.
Well, I was down the Keys and I was fishing. And somebody come up and said, "You got a telegram, you should look at it." And there was a notice that I had been recalled back to the Marine Corps. And I wasn't altogether pleased and happy about it because I was having a good time. And I've got to say, awfully worried about what was happening in the world.
No one was more surprised by a war in Korea than the generation of young Americans suddenly asked to fight for another country's freedom.
What were we saving? South Korea? From whom? North Koreans? The concept wasn't even there. What had the United Nations got to do with us? All we knew is that we had taken an oath and we assumed a responsibility, and we had a job to do, and the flag was flying, and that flag should never touch the ground.
In those days, if your country was engaged in a fight or a war with another country, you just automatically assumed that your country was right. And you also automatically assumed that the proper thing for you to do was to do your share and get in there and do what you could to win the war.
I was in the 24th Infantry Regiment, 25th Division, which is an all-black regiment. They sent me because I was a veteran of World War II.
I got into the war because they needed nurses very badly, and I just thought it was my duty to join and try to help out.
I was so gung-ho, they called me Sergeant Combat, and I wanted to be in combat to prove myself to these guys that I was as good as they were.
Unfortunately, I was one of the young men who would not go to school. So we doctored my baptismal certificate to put me up a couple years, and I got into the Army in April of 1950. But I certainly wish I would have stayed in high school.
The late 40s, in 1950, the first new cars appeared. And what excitement for a family to get a new car. The first housing was really going up. So you could finally move out of the fourth floor of the house with mom and dad with your bride and get your own little place.
World War II had ended just 5 years before. People were starry-eyed about the future. No one expected another war so soon.
You know, I think we have to go back a little bit historically and remind people of what it was like back then. Coming out of World War II, I don't think anyone had foreseen that communism was going to make such an all-out attempt to spread itself all over the world. And we saw this as a threat, and there was no guarantee that the free world was going to remain free.
Following World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union partitioned Korea along the 38th parallel. Two rival governments were formed, the Democratic Republic of Korea in the south and the Communist People's Democratic Republic of Korea in the north.
The Russians never really fully accepted the division of Korea. It was their clear intention, it became obvious in retrospect, to unify that country under communist control.
The war started because Stalin had a scheme to expand communist power in Asia. North Korea thought that America would not react. So they attacked with Soviet-made tanks, Yak fighter planes, and all heavy equipment provided by Moscow. Within 3 days, Seoul was taken by the Reds. Within 3 days.
We were very fearful that the conflict could spread beyond the Korean Peninsula.
On June 27, 1950, President Harry S. Truman committed American troops to help stop the invasion.
Harry Truman called it a police action so that he wouldn't have to go to Congress for a declaration of war.
The same day, the United Nations also voted to send troops to support democratic South Korea. The Soviets did not attend the session. Suddenly, the world was at war again.
We could have hardly gone into a war more poorly prepared than we did when we jumped so suddenly into the Korean War back in June of 1950.
U.S. occupation forces in Japan, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, were rushed to the Korean Peninsula.
The first United Nations troops were hopelessly outnumbered and outarmed. Their mission was to delay the enemy's advance in a desperate fight for time.
Lieutenant Colonel Charles Brad Smith of the 24th Division, his battalion was the first troops that made contact with the North Koreans as they were pouring down south of Seoul.
Initially, the South Korean army, as near as I have been able to gather, were terrified of the tanks to the extent that if tanks were in the vicinity, it was time to move out. General Church led me over to a map, and he said, all we need is somebody up here who won't run when they see tanks. About maybe 7:30, I could see something moving coming out of Suwon, 6 miles away. Very quickly, I determined it was a tank, and then another tank. And finally, it was 33 tanks coming our way. And we were 375 infantrymen. It turns out that we were being attacked by 2 regiments of the North Korean 4th Division, each regiment with a strength of 3,000.
He had no anti-tank weapons except little 2.36 rocket launchers. He started firing these pathetically like pea shooters at the enemy tanks, but the tanks just rolled right on through him.
I called my company commanders together and told them that if we were going to live to fight another day, we had better get out of here now.
Hey, when American troops first hit Korea, we thought, the North Koreans would run the minute they saw an American. They didn't run. They beat the hell out of us. And we had to keep retreating down the peninsula until we could find a position that could be defended with fewer troops than what was attacking us.